Berlin, 1945. The city that once symbolized Hitler's power now lies in ruins, its streets reduced to ash and echoes. Amid the chaos, Allied soldiers move through the wreckage, searching not only for survivors, but for secrets. Deep within the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, American counterintelligence corps officers uncover a sealed metal container marked Private RM. Inside, fragments of a journal, written in a tight, disciplined hand. The initials read RM, Rokas Misch, Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard, courier, and communications officer. Misch had been with Hitler since 1933, serving as one of the few men allowed inside the Führer's private quarters. Loyal, quiet, and ever-present, he manned the phones and guarded the doors as history unfolded behind them. To the outside world, he was a mere attendant, but within the walls of the Reich's inner sanctum, he was a witness to power, fear, and the slow unraveling of a regime that promised immortality, but found only ruin. The first pages of the recovered journal open in early September 1939, the week Germany invaded Poland. Misch writes of the tension in the Führer's command center at the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair. As reports came in of the Blitzkrieg's swift success, he was confident, one entry reads, but restless. He spoke to no one except Keitel and Jodl. When I entered, the air was heavy, like before a storm. From that moment, Misch's role became not just protection, but observation. Every whisper, every order, every hesitation passed by his watchful eyes. Historians would later piece together Misch's life from interrogation reports and his own post-war statements. Yet these private writings, seemingly unknown to Allied archives, paint a more intimate portrait. They show not just the Führer's paranoia, but also the quiet terror of those sworn to protect him. Misch noted the endless drills, the security codes changed daily, and the quiet paranoia that crept through every corridor. He trusted no one completely, the journal reads. Even I, who served at his door for years, never heard him laugh after 1942. As the war dragged on, the tone of the journal darkens. Misch describes the bombing raids on Berlin, the screams of civilians outside the Reich Chancellery, and the growing rift between Hitler and his generals. They spoke of retreat, he spoke of loyalty, he writes. In the silence after their meetings, I could hear his breathing, shallow, angry, defeated. For a man whose duty was absolute obedience, these observations hint at doubt, or at least disillusionment. By 1944, as the tide of war turned irreversibly, the journal entries become shorter, more hurried. One passage references the July 20th plot, the failed assassination attempt by German officers within Hitler's own circle. Misch records hearing the explosion from the Führer's bunker at the Wolf's Lair. We thought it was the end. He emerged shaken, burned, but alive. That night, the executions began. No one smiled again. From that day forward, suspicion infected every level of command. Even loyal men like Misch found themselves under quiet surveillance. Then, as the final weeks of the war closed in, the entries become frantic. Berlin was collapsing under Soviet assault. The Reich Chancellery shook nightly under artillery fire. Misch's notes from April 1945 are written in haste, his handwriting unsteady. The Russians are close. Orders come through, but they make no sense. He speaks of miracles, of Steiner, of divisions that no longer exist. These final words, half report, half confession, reveal the psychological breakdown of those trapped underground in the Führer bunker. The last legible line in the recovered fragment reads, "He will not surrender, and neither may we." Then abruptly the writing stops. The next page is burned beyond recognition. When Allied analysts examined the fragment, they noticed something unusual. Radio frequencies and call signs scribbled in the margins. They appeared to reference coded transmissions between the Chancellery and an unknown command post on the outskirts of Berlin. Was Misch merely transcribing communications for record, or was he concealing intelligence that never reached the official Nazi archives? The discovery sparked quiet interest among both American OSS and British MI5 officers. Who had Misch been reporting to in those final days? And more importantly, if these were his private journals, how did they survive when every document within the Führer bunker was ordered destroyed? As the ruins of Berlin continued to burn, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary diary. It was a first-hand account from the man who stood closer to Hitler than almost anyone alive, and it hinted at orders, decisions, and conversations that history had never recorded. The final Allied report, marked classified, ended with a single note. Fragments verified authentic, remaining content, missing. The mystery of those missing pages would set off a new kind of operation, one driven not by gunfire or bombs, but by the quiet pursuit of truth hidden within ashes. Spring 1945. The war's end seemed inevitable, but intelligence work had only just begun. In the coded halls of Bletchley Park, outside London, British cryptanalysts intercepted a string of transmissions unlike any they had seen before. Messages routed through collapsing German networks, marked with the strange call sign Schatten. Translated, it meant shadow. Each transmission bore a timestamp from central Berlin, and one name repeatedly appeared in the encryption tables, R-Mish. At that same moment, across the channel, the US Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, had its own puzzle. Reports from the front lines indicated that several SS couriers had escaped the ruins of Berlin with sealed packets marked for personal delivery to neutral embassies. One of those couriers, it was rumored, carried fragments of a journal written by someone close to Hitler himself. The Americans wanted it. The British wanted it. The Soviets were already searching for it. In early April 1945, as the Red Army surrounded Berlin, the OSS formed a small task group under Major Robert Taylor of the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, codenamed Operation Lantern. Its mission was to trace any surviving members of Hitler's personal security detail, including Mish, and retrieve whatever written materials remained from the Führerbunker before Soviet forces seized them. Intelligence reports suggested that the journals might contain not only eyewitness testimony, but also details of secret communications between the Chancellery and units still fighting west of the Oder. Back in Bletchley Park, linguist cryptographers examined the Schatten messages with growing unease. One line read, "Transfer initiated, files to be divided and carried by assigned guards." Another contained coordinates that pointed not to Berlin, but to the Harz Mountains, near the last operational headquarters of the Waffen-SS. The implication was staggering. While Hitler prepared for suicide beneath the Reich Chancellery, his subordinates might have been attempting to safeguard confidential material, possibly even plans for post-war escape or contact with sympathetic nations. The British Intelligence Directorate alerted Field Marshal Montgomery, who ordered immediate coordination with US forces advancing from the west. Whatever these documents are, his memo read, they must not fall into Soviet hands. It was a race, one fought through decoded messages, interrogation reports, and the ruins of communication lines collapsing by the hour. Meanwhile, inside the Führerbunker, Mish continued his routine, manning the switchboards and carrying messages between rooms. According to later testimony, he never left his post, even as shells fell on the Chancellery. His surviving statements after the war confirm that coded messages still passed through Hitler's underground communications center well into the final week of April. "They kept coming," he recalled. "Some from outside Berlin, some from unknown sources. We didn't ask questions, we just connected the calls." The journals recovered by Allied forces contained notations of these calls, though their content remains unknown. On April 16, 1945, as Soviet artillery opened the Battle of Berlin, OSS intercept units at the front noted a last burst of German encrypted traffic, again signed Schatten, then silence. The channel went dead. When Berlin finally fell on May 2nd, the Soviets were first to reach the Chancellery ruins. They seized what remained of Hitler's bunker, removing files, bodies, and communications equipment. But by the time American CIC officers entered the city weeks later, they discovered evidence of missing materials, file drawers emptied, documents burned, and traces of hasty destruction. In a side office adjoining the main communications room, US soldiers found fragments of a notebook bearing burn marks and partial English translations, likely the same fragments later archived under Major Taylor's custody. The British, however, pursued another angle. At Bletchley, the final decrypted Schatten message, reconstructed from incomplete intercepts, contained one chilling phrase: "The witness carries what must not be spoken." Intelligence analysts debated its meaning. Some believed the witness referred to Hitler himself. Others suspected it pointed to someone close, perhaps Mish, whose role made him both messenger and observer. Weeks after Germany's surrender, OSS and MI5 officers launched parallel efforts to locate Misch, but the bodyguard had vanished amid the collapse of Berlin, presumed dead or captured by the Soviets. Still, rumors persisted that he had been seen near the Tiergarten in civilian clothing, carrying a satchel. None of the Allied powers could confirm his whereabouts. The existence of Operation Schatten was quietly removed from official records by 1946. Only a handful of intelligence officers ever saw the decoded fragments. One declassified memo from Bletchley reads, "If Misch's journal exists in full, it represents a primary psychological record of Hitler's inner circle. Its loss constitutes a historical and moral void." Yet the mystery deepened further when British intercept logs showed one final Schatten message, transmitted 3 days after Hitler's death. The signal originated not from Berlin, but from a relay station near the Austrian border, hundreds of kilometers away. If the Führer was gone, who sent it? And how did the code continue without him? That unanswered question would haunt Allied intelligence for years, turning a simple recovery mission into a quiet obsession, the pursuit of the missing witness, and the truth buried within his unseen pages. Berlin, May 1945. The air still reeked of smoke and decay when American soldiers of the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, entered the shattered remains of the Reich Chancellery. The walls were blackened by fire, corridors lined with broken marble and twisted cables. Among the debris lay the personal effects of men who had once ruled a continent, now reduced to relics of a failed empire. Inside one of the lower offices, a young CIC lieutenant brushed aside dust and found a charred leather notebook. Faded initials marked the cover, RM. The notebook's pages were fragile, warped by heat, but legible enough to tell a story. The private observations of Rochus Misch, Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard, telephonist and courier. His words captured the final days of the Führer bunker with unflinching detail. What he wrote was not propaganda, nor defense. It was survival put to paper. The entries began on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's last birthday. Misch noted the ceremonial arrival of Goebbels, Bormann, and others, bringing gifts and forced smiles while artillery thundered above. He seemed distant, the entry reads, eyes fixed on the war map. He asked for the divisions that no longer existed. In the days that followed, Berlin disintegrated. The Red Army pressed inward street by street. Soviet tanks stood within sight of the Brandenburg Gate. Hitler refused to leave the city, declaring he would stand or fall in the capital. Misch's notes describe the claustrophobic routine underground. The constant hum of air filters, the stale air, the faint vibration of artillery through concrete. We lived like ghosts, he wrote. Outside was fire, inside, only whispers and waiting. The journal also reveals conversations previously unknown to historians. One entry, dated April 26th, mentions a coded message that arrived through the bunker's last working communication line. Steiner to engage north of Berlin. Confirmation requested. Misch's note beside it reads simply, "No such unit remains." The so-called Steiner offensive, Hitler's imagined counterattack, was the breaking point for many inside. General Jodl reportedly tried to reason with him, but Hitler's orders grew detached from reality. Misch, confined to the switchboard, recorded every futile command. He gave orders to ghosts, one line reads. Amid the chaos, the notebook makes a cryptic reference. Channel 9 to our station. Direct order, not logged. Allied analysts would later interpret this as an unregistered radio frequency, possibly used to transmit emergency communications to SS outposts outside Berlin. The margins of the page show faint code groups, 5-digit numbers repeated in intervals, similar to one-time pad transmissions. If accurate, this implied that even in collapse, Hitler's bunker maintained secret contact with forces beyond the city, and that Misch, as radio operator, may have been the last to handle those signals. On April 29th, Misch recorded that he witnessed Hitler dictating his last will and political testament. The Führer's voice, he wrote, was calm but hollow. Bormann and Goebbels stood nearby, their faces frozen with fear. After the dictation, Hitler shook hands with those remaining and retreated to his private quarters. Misch wrote that he heard Eva Braun laughing faintly behind the closed door, the last sound of levity in the bunker. By the following afternoon, both were dead. Then silence. Misch's next entry is brief, written shakily. The door was locked. The shots came quickly. No one spoke. Afterward, orders came down to burn the bodies. Misch, still at his post, described hearing the sound of footsteps above, the scent of burning fuel mixing with dust. It was over, he wrote, but no one could leave. After May 1st, the handwriting changes. The lines grow erratic, phrases incomplete. One final entry reads, radioactive, instructions continue from unknown voice, code unverified, orders for silence. This chilling note was underlined twice. Historians later speculated that Misch might have intercepted rogue transmissions from remaining SS units, or even Soviet deception broadcasts. Yet the identity of the unknown voice was never determined. When the CIC catalogued the notebook, several pages had been deliberately torn out. Burn marks indicated an attempt to destroy it, but someone had saved what they could, perhaps Misch himself before fleeing. The Americans sealed the surviving fragments under evidence tag CIC BER 45-17 and sent them to Allied command in Frankfurt. Only a partial transcript remains today. The contents sent ripples through intelligence circles. The references to unauthorized channels, Channel 9, R Station, Operation Shatten, aligned with earlier Bletchley Park intercepts. British intelligence officers requested access to the material, but American command refused, classifying it under psychological warfare research. Officially, the document never existed. Still, one question persisted among the analysts who examined it. If Misch's final entries recorded active communications after Hitler's death, who was giving the orders? And more disturbingly, were they ever carried out? The last words of the surviving pages echo like a whisper from beneath the rubble. They said we must obey until the last signal, and so we waited, in the dark. Outside, the Soviets sealed off the bunker. Inside, the last witnesses vanished into history. What remained was a notebook, a testament not only to the end of a regime, but to the strange persistence of loyalty even when the cause itself had died. Yet within its missing pages may lie something far more troubling. The shadow of an operation that refused to end when the war did. Summer 1945. The war was over, at least on paper. But across the newly divided ruins of Europe, the hunt for truth had only begun. Allied investigators combed through mountains of captured documents, interrogating anyone with even a whisper of proximity to Hitler. Yet for every confirmed testimony, another disappeared. And among those missing were several men once assigned to protect the Führer himself. British intelligence, now operating from its Berlin liaison offices, began to notice a pattern. 3 members of Hitler's personal security staff, including SS Sturmbannführer Otto Günscher, Hitler's adjutant, and 2 lesser-known guards from the Reich Chancellery detail, had vanished from Soviet custody. Moscow denied any knowledge of their whereabouts. Western observers quietly suspected otherwise. By August 1945, American CIC agents were exchanging encrypted memos under the subject Disappearance of Witnesses, Führerbunker. Attached were fragments of the Misch journal and a warning handwritten by an officer. Psychological risk, loyalty patterns unclear. It was around this time that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, now overseeing British occupation forces in Germany, received a peculiar intelligence summary from the War Office. The report was titled Project A: Psychological Loyalty Mechanisms of Hitler's Inner Circle. Based on interrogations and captured diaries, it aimed to understand how absolute loyalty was maintained under impossible conditions. The analysis referenced Misch's writings repeatedly. The subject describes obedience not as duty, but as identity, it noted. Fear of betrayal outweighed fear of death. This was no mere curiosity. The Allies needed to understand the psychology that had driven ordinary men to commit extraordinary acts of devotion, even as their world collapsed around them. The report concluded that Hitler's command structure had functioned like a cult, blending military discipline with personal dependency. Those closest to him, one British psychiatrist wrote, were conditioned to confuse loyalty with existence. To betray him was to cease being. Misch's journal entries, stripped of emotion yet steeped in fatalism, became key evidence in this analysis. Meanwhile, US intelligence teams continued tracing the rumor of the missing guards. A CIC field unit stationed in Nuremberg intercepted whispers of former SS officers regrouping under assumed identities in Bavaria and Austria. One of them, reportedly calling himself Rainer M., matched Misch's description, but no official confirmation followed. Whether this man was truly the missing bodyguard or another survivor of the bunker remained uncertain. Still, the Americans pressed forward, aware that any remaining witnesses could hold answers, not only to Hitler's final hours, but to lingering mysteries about Nazi gold, hidden communications, and the shadow of Operation Schatten. In November 1945, as the Nuremberg trials began, Allied prosecutors assembled their case against the architects of Nazi terror. But behind the courtroom scenes, another set of files, marked classified, was quietly passed between British and American hands. These files contained the psychological profiles of those who had served Hitler most intimately, including snippets from Misch's journal and notes on the disappearances of his colleagues. The intent was not legal but analytical, to understand loyalty as a weapon of control. One fragment from the Misch notebook, translated by British intelligence, read, "He told us that the walls had ears, but not the heart. The heart must remain silent." The line was underlined in red. Analysts interpreted it as a coded metaphor, or perhaps literal instruction, given to the inner circle to guard Hitler's image at all costs. To remain silent, wrote one MI5 summary, was itself an act of loyalty, even in defeat. By early 1946, the Americans compiled a joint intelligence memorandum concluding that key personnel connected to the Führer bunker and its communications team remain unaccounted. 4. Soviet authorities provided inconsistent reports. Moscow claimed that all surviving staff were in custody. British sources countered that 2 had been executed without trial. In truth, the fog of occupation made verification impossible. It was as if the final witnesses to Hitler's death had been erased, one by one. For Allied intelligence, the disappearance of these men was not just a logistical problem, but a moral one. The full truth of Hitler's final days now rested on testimonies filtered through propaganda, fear, and silence. Misch's missing pages, still classified, still incomplete, represented both a tantalizing clue and a haunting absence. If loyalty could survive beyond the fall of the Reich, what else might have endured in secret? As the months passed, the pursuit of Project A expanded into what would later become early Cold War psychological research. The same methods used to decode obedience in the Reich would soon be applied to understand loyalty within the Soviet system. Misch's journal became an unlikely bridge, a human document that revealed how belief could outlive ideology. By the end of 1946, most of the recovered fragments were locked away in Allied archives. The official report concluded with a final note from Montgomery himself. "The mind of a loyal man is a fortress, difficult to breach, harder still to understand." Outside, Europe was rebuilding. Inside the sealed vaults of London and Washington, however, a different reconstruction was underway. Not of cities, but of minds. And somewhere between those vanished witnesses and the burned pages of a bodyguard's notebook, the true story of loyalty and fear remained, deliberately or fatefully, out of reach. Nuremberg, 1946. The courtroom was crowded with faces of the fallen Reich, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, the architects of terror now reduced to defendants. Yet behind the spectacle of justice, a quieter investigation continued in shadow. In a locked archive beneath the Palace of Justice, US intelligence officers reviewed a small collection of wartime materials too sensitive for public display. Among them lay the charred fragments of a journal, Rochus Misch's notes, recovered months earlier from the wreckage of Berlin. Officially, the journal was deemed non-essential to prosecution. Unofficially, it was anything but. The CIC, now integrated with the OSS under the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, examined the text for hidden references to command orders or escape routes. A handwritten annotation in the margin of one fragment caught their attention. South Passage cleared, orders sealed. The phrase corresponded to rumors already circulating through Allied intelligence that members of the SS and Nazi leadership had fled southward in the war's final hours, possibly through underground channels extending from Berlin to Bavaria. The Americans were determined to know whether Misch had played a role in these last communications. In early testimony, he had claimed that after Hitler's death, he left the bunker to surrender to Soviet troops and was captured. But inconsistencies in his account, particularly concerning the final transmissions he handled, raised doubts. An OSS report from March 1946 summarized the problem succinctly. Subject demonstrates high loyalty threshold, low reliability index, omits key events from 27-30 April period. To intelligence officers, that gap was not coincidence. It was concealment. As the Nuremberg trials unfolded, Allied prosecutors quietly filtered through the notebook's content. While much of it detailed the claustrophobic final weeks in the bunker, a few pages stood apart. They referenced code words unfamiliar even to German intelligence experts: Schatten, Channel 9, and Echo Room. These might have been internal designations for communication circuits, but one British analyst proposed a more chilling interpretation: evacuation routes for personnel and documentation deemed essential to state continuity. In other words, escape plans. Meanwhile, British intelligence at MI6 cross-referenced Misch's entries with field reports from Austria and northern Italy, where remnants of the SS Alpenfestung, or Alpine Fortress, were rumoured to be regrouping. One intercepted communication from May 1945 mentioned the delivery of sensitive materials from the Führer's staff. The message was unsigned but carried the same encryption pattern as the earlier Schatten transmissions from Berlin. To those studying the case, it seemed possible that portions of Misch's journal, or copies thereof, had been smuggled out before the bunker fell. By mid-1946, an uneasy alliance of British and American analysts met weekly in Frankfurt under the joint operation codename Silence Archive. Their purpose: determine the authenticity and scope of Misch's writings, and whether they connected to other Nazi documents that had mysteriously vanished after Germany's surrender. The findings were troubling. Several notations from the charred journal matched passages in reports recovered from Himmler's personal files, suggesting shared intelligence or deliberate editing after the fact. One American officer speculated that portions of the journal had been rewritten to obscure certain events, possibly by Misch himself under Soviet interrogation. Yet no proof emerged. That summer, the OSS drafted an internal memorandum marked "Confidential" for Psychological Warfare Division. It advised that the journal should not be released for public or legal purposes, as its narrative introduces uncertainty regarding established timelines and chain of command in the Führerbunker. In short, the document challenged the official version of Hitler's final days. Some within the War Department feared it might even fuel conspiracy theories, that Hitler had escaped, or that secret negotiations had occurred behind the scenes. To avoid such speculation, sections of the notebook were redacted and sealed. The surviving text, no more than 20 pages, was archived in Washington under restricted file number 472-11, accessible only to high-level analysts. The rest, according to later declassified notes, was destroyed. Still, questions lingered. British officers at Bletchley Park protested the suppression, arguing that the journal could hold invaluable psychological insight into the loyalty dynamics of Hitler's closest staff. But by autumn of 1946, the decision was final. The fragments were classified indefinitely. The public would never know their contents. Outside the courtroom, journalists chronicled the visible face of justice, the verdicts, the hangings, the end of the Reich. Yet deep within the intelligence community, another story was taking shape. A quiet reckoning with the realization that history's clean conclusions rarely aligned with the murky truth of war. Years later, an MI5 memo from December 1946 summarized the dilemma with haunting precision. In attempting to define loyalty, we find ourselves staring into the same abyss it served. Misch's account, incomplete as it is, forces us to confront a darker question. When obedience becomes identity, can truth ever survive it? The Allied powers closed their files. The charred pages were locked away. But the mystery of Misch, of the missing transmissions, and of the suppressed evidence refused to rest. Historians would later wonder whether the silence that followed was an act of protection, or the continuation of the very secrecy the war was meant to end. And somewhere, in a sealed cabinet labelled classified psychological material, the echoes of a bodyguard's final words still waited. A silent testimony from the last man to guard the most feared leader in modern history. Decades later, in the archives of London and Moscow, dust-covered folders began to surface. declassified fragments from a war that had ended, but never truly closed. Among them were reports once stamped, "Top secret, not for release." Inside lay microfilm copies of interrogation transcripts, radio intercepts and intelligence memos referring to a name long forgotten outside academic circles: Rokas Misch. Hitler's loyal bodyguard, the silent observer of the Führerbunker's final collapse. His journals, burned, buried and suppressed, had become legend, a phantom document haunting historians and intelligence officers alike. By the 1970s, Cold War analysts on both sides of the Iron Curtain revisited the case for a different reason. The Soviet KGB had released partial records of post-war interrogations conducted in 1946. One dossier, titled Subject: Misch, Rokas Karl, included transcripts of his time in Lubyanka prison, Moscow. In them, Misch described Hitler's final moments with detached precision. But there was more. He mentioned that certain documents were taken by higher officers before the Soviets arrived. When pressed for details, Misch refused to elaborate, saying only, "They carried the words that were not meant to die." For decades, those words lingered in secrecy, until a small group of historians gained limited access to declassified Soviet files in 1992. Among the recovered papers were notes written by a KGB analyst who had reviewed the Misch interrogation. Subject remains evasive. Possible reference to hidden archives or psychological materials removed from bunker prior to Soviet arrival. Suspect knowledge of encrypted transmission Shatten. Once again, the name of that mysterious operation resurfaced. The same code name first intercepted by British cryptographers half a century earlier. Meanwhile, in the British National Archives, declassification under the 50-year rule unearthed the corresponding Bletchley Park intercept logs. There, the final Shatten message, dated May 2, 1945, 3 days after Hitler's death, was listed with a single translation note. Source unverified. Transmission from Alpine region. Message reads, "The witness has departed. The rest is silence." It was never explained, never cross-referenced, and until then, never seen by the public. The convergence of these fragments, Soviet interrogation files, Allied intercepts and the burned remains of a private journal, reopened an old question. What, exactly, was Misch protecting? Some historians argued that the so-called missing pages were destroyed to prevent embarrassment to Allied powers, containing hints of attempted negotiations or contacts with neutral countries in Hitler's final days. Others believed the truth was simpler, that Misch, like so many in his position, edited his memories to survive captivity and history's judgment. Yet the mystery endures because of one small, peculiar fact. When Rokas Misch finally returned to Germany in 1954, after 9 years in Soviet custody, he never reclaimed any personal property from wartime. When interviewed decades later, he stated plainly, "I left everything in the bunker. It was not mine to keep." Historians now suspect that the Soviets confiscated more than his belongings. Perhaps the last intact version of his journal, a copy never acknowledged in Western archives. In the 1980s, a brief flicker of new evidence appeared. A retired East German intelligence officer claimed that a sealed dossier labelled File 12b, Der Leibwächter, had been stored in a Stasi archive near Potsdam, containing portions of Misch's notes and photographs from inside the Chancellery. When the Berlin Wall fell, the building housing those files was looted. Its contents vanished into private hands. To this day, the alleged file has never resurfaced. Modern researchers who've pieced together these traces describe Misch as both participant and prisoner, a man bound to his role by fear and devotion. His writings, though fragmented, expose the moral vacuum at the heart of absolute power, a world where obedience replaced thought and silence became survival. In the words of British historian Dr. Alan Havers, Misch's greatest act of loyalty was not to Hitler, but to secrecy itself. He understood that some truths, once spoken, would destroy what little remained of him. And so, the story ends not with revelation, but with absence. The private journals of Hitler's bodyguard, whether lost, hidden, or deliberately erased, remain one of the lingering enigmas of World War II's final chapter. Their fragments whisper of the unseen machinery behind dictatorship, the quiet compliance, the the psychological bonds, the fear disguised as faith. For the world, the war ended in May 1945. For men like Ruckus Mish, it never truly did. His duty, once to guard a life, became to guard a secret, one he carried until his death in 2013. When he was asked, late in life, whether he regretted his loyalty, his answer was chillingly simple. It was my post. I stayed until the end. The last words of his journal, preserved only in fragments, read, "History belongs to those who survive it, but truth belongs to none." Perhaps that is why the file remains missing, why intelligence agencies quietly close their investigations, and why the echo of those final transmissions, "The witness has departed," still haunts historians today. Because in the ashes of Berlin, and in the mind of one silent guard, the war between fear and loyalty never truly ended.